In courageous response to the Pelagian threat, St Augustine, his defense of the gratuity of grace, set the stage for all future debates regarding human nature. St. Augustine's aim, of course, was a defense of the fully gratuitous nature of God's gift. God does not give his divine grace as what is due to one who works for a wage, but rather as a gift from the one who freely justifies the ungodly, as St. Paul would insist. But for St. Augustine, the stakes were high, far higher than a simple fidelity, or lack thereof, to St. Paul, as if that wasn't high enough. What was at stake in the debate was a fundamental human posture towards divine sovereignty, the corruption of which threatened to compromise every aspect of Christian life. The gift of grace expresses God's omnipotent goodness, infinite and fully active, which in no way responds passively to creaturely incentives or promptings, but rather expresses a goodness that in every way remains fully active. The gift of God's grace is never a passive response to the goodness of the creature, as if creaturely goodness holds God's activity to account, but rather the reverse. The goodness of the creature is always an effect of a prior divine initiative, a gift, whereby the creature's goodness is first received from God as a gratuitous participation in his fullness. Creaturely goodness is always an effect of the divine gratuity, never a cause of the divine gratuity. And this is what was at stake for St. Augustine, as he rightly saw it. And all subsequent debates over grace and nature have been forced to contend on this playing field. And Augustine defended the gratuity of grace until his dying day. Yet, many throughout Christian history have assumed that Augustine purchased this fidelity to the gratuity of grace at a great cost, that his defense was bought and paid for at the price of demoting the goodness and intelligibility of human nature itself. The fully active role of divine grace for salvation must, some have assumed, demote the activity of nature to a type of hollow receptacle for the divine omnipotence acting upon it, type of tabula rasa upon which the divine will works, or an empty vessel into which grace would pour. As a result, theological thought regarding human nature has bounced back and forth between multiple, even conflicting conclusions. From the total depravity of human nature on the one hand, to the assumption that all human natural goodness is some kind of a divine, or some kind of a anonymous grace to an anonymous Christian on the other hand, we simply don't know what to make of human nature. We don't know what to do with it. We don't. And in our effort to contend with Augustine's defense, we might sacrifice the gratuity of grace for the goodness of human nature, or the goodness of human nature for the necessity of grace. Yet in either case, what was at stake for Augustine remains at stake for us today. And any simplistic clinging to the one at the expense of the other, as Augustine understood it, would threaten a constituent feature of the very foundation of Christian faith. What we need is a model that upholds both. We need a model wherein the gratuity, sovereignty, and necessity of grace for salvation meets the full integrity, goodness, and intelligibility of created human nature, and both synchronize together. In this presentation, I would like to propose that such a model would keep with the theme of this conference, that is the royal priesthood and the renewal of the church. I will propose that the very sacramental dispensation of grace and the very instrumental nature of the sacramental priesthood can be used as a model that at once protects the fully passive potency of nature to receive the gratuitous grace of God, and yet at the same time upholds and even requires the ontological status of human nature as specifically good, intelligible on its own, specified by its own natural teleology, abstracting from divine grace. But let me be clear what I intend to do and not to do in this presentation. First, I in no way propose to insert into these debates some innovation above that contained in the many books written on this topic. I am indebted to the giants on whose shoulders I stand. I am also fully aware of how the endless nuance and minutiae of these grace-nature debates can cause a type of debate fatigue. But what I do propose then is what I hope to be a kind of remedy for this debate fatigue through a renewed appreciation of what is actually at stake in the debate. I insist that a failure to recognize the gravity of the grace-nature's supernatural-natural distinction is nothing more than a failure to recognize the actual price we pay if we get the question wrong. And using the sacramental nature of the royal priesthood as a lens through which to see the grace-nature distinction, I would insist, will remind us of the gravity of this question. Okay. The debate itself. Eruptions of the grace-nature debate pepper theological history. And for the last few centuries, these debates have served as markers of allegiance to certain schools in the interpretation of the thought of St. Thomas, all sides claiming to be the true inheritors of his teaching. The most recent of these eruptions is the debate sparked by Henri de Lubac in his Sur Natural, published in 1946, with two subsequent articles published in 1948, Duplex Hominis Beatitudo in 1949, The Mystery of the Supernatural, wherein he posits in man an innate and unconditional desire for a supernatural end. But what does that mean? What does it mean? Why is this important? De Lubac's claim of man's natural desire to see God posits within man an innate inclination to the supernatural as a constituent part of his specific nature as a rational animal created in the imago Dei. This suggests that just as all things by virtue of their nature have an innate ordering and inclination to their proportionate natural end, so does man, by his specific nature, possess an inclination to the supernatural. And man, by virtue of his creation in the imago Dei, is naturally proportioned to a supernatural end. Thus, just as a rock inclines by nature to its proportionate natural place, the center of a gravitational field, and possesses an analogous desire, through analogy, for that natural place as a constituent part of its very nature, so does the human person, by virtue of his creation in the imago Dei, possess an innate inclination to the supernatural to which that created imago proportions him. This claim of de Lubac brought an older debate to the fore, not because of what it affirmed, but more importantly, because of what it denies. De Lubac's claim came prepackaged with a denial of a state of pure nature, conceptual possibility of a state of pure nature, a natura pura, that the Dominican and Jesuit Thomistic tradition had posited as an indispensable tool for understanding the distinction between the natural and the supernatural. For de Lubac, man's specific nature is innately ordered to the vision of God, his essence unintelligible apart from that ordering. And the positing of a state of pure nature, as the commentatorial tradition had, would be, for de Lubac, a redundancy at best and an outright misguided anthropology at worst. In his own words, quote, "From the fact that God ordered man to the vision of himself as to man's ultimate end by establishing man in his image, it follows that a state of pure nature is impossible." End quote. Sur Natural 166. But when I say that de Lubac's claim revived an older debate, what do I mean? De Lubac claimed to follow a tradition of Thomistic interpretation tracing its genealogy back to Giles of Rome, Aegidius Romanus, himself a student of St. Thomas in Paris and a member of the order of St. Augustine. And whereas St. Thomas became a standard for Dominican theology, Giles would become the same for the Augustinians, the Dominicans officially endorsing St. Thomas in 1286 and the Augustinians doing the same, 1287, adopting Giles as their official doctor. The subsequent Augustinian tradition, then, read St. Thomas through the interpretive lens of Giles. And although this less recognized Aegidian tradition, as it is called, is indeed less recognized in theology, it can boast of some very influential players throughout history. I won't read my entire article here. This tradition then claims that a more authentic Thomas emerges if read through the Augustinianism of Giles. And this is what de Lubac claimed. That is, that the main commentatorial tradition had departed from St. Thomas's true thought by restricting humanity's innate desire to an end merely naturally achievable. And in positing a purely natural end to man, an end and happiness naturally achievable, the commentatorial tradition planted the seeds from which modern secularism would grow. For a summary of this criticism, I'll direct one to the work of John Milbank, particularly his Suspended Middle. But what was the source of the conflict? What's the point? In his Summa Theologiae, St. Thomas outlines various states of human nature perduring through various points of salvation history. At his creation, man possessed integrity, with the preternatural gifts flowing from created grace. Human nature was created in grace, possessing a greater integrity because of this grace. This is a revealed truth. Following the pride of our first parents, humanity entered a state deprived of grace. And in this depraved state, human nature lost the infused virtues, the preternatural gifts, and endured the wounds of ignorance, malice, weakness, and concupiscence. Man's depraved state was wounded and in need of a healing that it could not perform on its own. But the salvation won through our Lord Jesus Christ restores the life of grace to the soul. Our wounded nature may be healed, restored, redeemed, and then elevated by the free gift of divine grace to a state greater than its original. Now, in our graced state, although the four wounds of our first parents' sin remain, we are nonetheless strengthened to overcome sin, to grow in friendship with God, and become partakers of the divine nature, a calling that categorically surpasses even our parents' first state. Through this redemption, the created divine image, the imago Dei, is perfected in us, a perfection wherein the created image transposes into a participated likeness to God. Slowly, movement by movement, the gift of grace and the theological virtues elevate the created powers of intellect and will, in which God's image resides, to a true participation in divine life. The divine image reaches its perfection in the state of glory, where faith and hope pass into charity, and we will see God face to face and be fully deified in this vision. Yet, the Thomistic tradition insists that the created divine image is not sufficient on its own to order the human person to a supernatural end. And why? Every created human soul images its divine creator through what the tradition calls an image of representation, wherein the rational powers of the soul embody a created fingerprint of uncreated Trinitarian life. Following St. Augustine, St. Thomas recognizes the created soul's act of knowing and loving as dynamically imaging the divine self-knowledge and self-love constitutive of the Trinitarian persons. I refer, of course, to the psychological analogy. Yet there remains an infinite gap between the creator and the creature. There must. However much human knowing and loving might represent the divine image, there is an infinite gap between the created intellect and will and the divine. Thus, there is no proportion between created human knowing and loving and the supernatural, sufficient to generate an innate desire for God as a specific component of human nature itself. By nature, then, the human person possesses an innate inclination to know and love in modes proportioned to that created nature. Since our nature is to know as soul-body composites, we are naturally proportioned to know God through his creation, by reasoning from effects back to their cause. As a result, a desire to know God is indeed natural. It is natural to man. But the naturalness of this desire must be as elicited from philosophic wonder. That is, once we know created things as effects, we desire to know their cause. And once we know that a cause exists, the mind doesn't rest until it knows the quiddity of that cause, what it is. But nonetheless, however natural this desire to know God may be, it must remain an elicited desire, never an innate, unconditional, or pre-deliberative desire proportioned to the supernatural flowing from man's specific nature. Why is this important, and what's the point? Since the creature always remains, by nature, proportioned to a created end, the creature's proportion to the supernatural, that is, proportion to God, could only arise from a superadded gift of God to the creature, raising the creature above its natural proportion. This superadded gift is the gift of grace. And following Augustine's defense of the gratuity and necessity of grace, only the superadded gift of grace could order human nature to a supernatural end and render the human person, as St. Peter says, a partaker of divine nature. It is then through this graced proportion to the supernatural that the human intellect and will can extend to God, not qua end, but as object, through the supernatural virtues of faith, hope, and love. But without this superadded gift of grace, there remains no proportion between human knowing and loving and the divine, no proportion that could innately incline to the divine qua object. This requires grace. And St. Thomas is so clear in his language in outlining the natural, innate inclinations of the natural law. St. Thomas is clear. We do not possess a natural inclination to know God, but he says specifically to know the truth about God. He says in outlining these natural inclinations to live in society and to know the truth about God. And that's important because we cannot know God qua object without gratuitous grace. We can't. Or again, man's natural knowledge of God, generative of a natural religion, natural worship, is only proportioned to God as end. This separates the virtue of religion from the theological virtues. Natural religion and the act of worship flowing from innate knowledge of God as creator is only proportioned to God as end. Natural religion, no matter how devotion-filled it might be, could never establish a divine friendship, a truly divine friendship. This requires grace in the soul, proportioning the human soul to God. Or again, still in the Prima Secundae, question 62, Article 1, St. Thomas puts on the lips of his third objector this very contention, that human knowledge and love are by their nature ordered to God, so supernatural virtue is unnecessary. The objector says, by their very nature, reason and will is directed to the first beginning and last end of man's nature. Therefore, there is no need for any habits of theological virtue to direct reason and will to God. But St. Thomas answers, the reason and will are naturally directed to God inasmuch as he is the beginning and end of nature, but in proportion to nature. But the reason and will, according to their nature, are not sufficiently directed to God insofar as he is the object of supernatural happiness. End quote. So now we can see the point. If we presume human nature to be innately ordered to the supernatural, we will render the gift of grace a redundancy. If such an innate order to the supernatural exists in man's nature, the role played by grace in the Christian tradition simply collapses into the innate ordering of the created imago Dei. This, then, is the genesis of the conceptual state of pure nature, posited by the commentatorial tradition. Not that such a state of pure nature was ever a historic reality. We were created in grace. This is divinely revealed truth. Nor that historic man in the depraved state could ever opt to return to some pure nature. No, we are wounded and in need of a Savior even to achieve our natural or co-natural end. But the state of pure nature was posited only to protect the sheer gratuity and necessity of grace. I would argue that it actually protects Aquinas the Augustinian. Positing a pure nature does not demote the need for grace, but ensures it. It does not erect an arena of the secular, but I would argue actually prevents an arena from arising. Without a conceptually real notion of a pure nature, the principle of grace, rendering us partakers of the divine nature, proportioning our created nature to a supernatural end, or ordering our natural powers to God as object, becomes either a non-gratuitous part of our specific nature, that is owed to our specific nature, or becomes an unnecessary redundancy, a principle ordering our nature to an end to which we're already ordered through creation. In either way, the gratuitous nature and necessary character of grace, as the Christian tradition has understood it, is lost. So now let's turn a corner. The royal priesthood as a model for what's actually at stake. So let's return to the theme of the conference, the royal priesthood and the renewal of the church. I would like to use this theme as a touchstone to reflect on the importance of the question. Let us re-ask, what's actually at stake? In his plan of salvation, revealed to us, God's grace, though fully supernatural, does not come to us randomly as some deus ex machina from above. Instead, God freely chooses to give us grace through a sacramental dispensation in which created, material, and natural signs function as instruments communicating grace through their sign value. Through the sacramental economy, the sign value woven into created things truly makes present and effective the grace it signifies. This means that the created sign values of created things, human words, human gestures, human actions, may become instruments by which God, as principle calls, truly causes a supernatural effect in the world, an effect that, at one and the same time, transcends the natural power of the created instrument, yet also depends on that very created sign value for its causality. This is the very dynamism of instrumental causality. So in the sacramental economy, for which the royal priesthood is a fundamental part, natural signs matter, and human nature matters. Human nature matters. Created human realities signify and make present, through the power of God, the graces to which they point. And we cannot arbitrarily demote the sign without changing the sacramental realities they make present. But here's the key. If natural human realities are to function as real instrumental causes of supernatural effects that transcend them, they must contain an intelligible nature of their own, a natural teleology, capable of a natural signification that is even transcendable in the first place. Just as an axe must retain its full access to function as an instrument in the hand of the carpenter, so must human realities retain an intelligible natural teleology to function as instrumental signs in the hand of a divine principal cause. Thus, the whole sacramental dispensation of grace, as the Church has understood it, not only depends on the infinite power of God to effect grace, but also on the natural signification of created reality. Created human nature must contain a natural ordering to natural ends to which it is proportioned, to instrumentally signify a grace only proportioned to a supernatural principal cause. And if human nature were innately ordered to a supernatural end, the sign value of its innate ordering would cease to be an instrumental cause at all and would rather collapse into the causality of its principal agent. The sign value of instrumental human nature would fall to grace's principal cause. The human instrument would bleed into grace, and human nature would become quasi-divine. Human nature would become a type of source of grace. And once this occurs, anything like a sacramental mediation of grace through natural signs, the very dynamism of the royal priesthood, would be rendered unnecessary. The very reality of a royal priesthood, that is a mediating, truly human instrument of grace, would become an expendable redundancy. Thus, the entire instrumentality of the sacramental economy of grace may be threatened if we lose a conceptual sense of the natural teleology of human nature, ordered naturally to its co-natural end. From all of this, we can conclude that the all too popular opposition between the gift of grace and the pure nature posited by the tradition is simply false. God's gratuitous grace and the coherence of a state of pure nature are not somehow nested on two opposing sides of a conceptual teeter-totter, wherein if we elevate the value of one, we will demote the value of the other, or vice versa. This is a deception. The opposite is the case. If we sacrifice the state of pure nature under the presumption that we can somehow save the supernatural, we will find that we have actually not saved the supernatural or left with the supernatural at all. No, instead, if we sacrifice a state of pure nature, we will find that we have also sacrificed the gratuitous grace along with it. And why? Not because human nature is in any way the source of grace, but because the intelligibility of nature itself was already a gift of that same God. And if we lose God's gift of a pure, intelligible human nature, then we can in no way presume to hold on to the added gratuity of God's grace, a gift that presupposes human nature, heals, elevates, and then perfects human nature unto glory. The gratuity of grace would simply collapse into the first gratuity of all creation. And when grace becomes so unnecessary, so also would become unnecessary all the instrumental means, fully intelligible in their own right, by which God gives his grace to creatures. So I would conclude then that the renewal of the church and a true renewal of an understanding of the royal priesthood must first recognize what is at stake in the debates over the relationship between grace and human nature. Thank you.